In 1974, a young geologist named Ethan Hayes went on a short expedition to the Black Creek Caves. He told his fiancée he would be back for dinner. He entered one of the caves to take a rock sample. By his own estimation, he spent no more than 5 minutes inside. But when Ethan Hayes stepped back out into the sunlight, the year was 2024. This is the story of a man who pressed pause while the world around him lived for half a century. And the question that still haunts scientists is, where was he for all those 50 years? Hello. What you are about to hear is not science fiction. It is a reconstruction of one of the strangest documented cases in modern history, known in small circles as Case Number 74. The story of Ethan Hayes is not just a mystery. It is a profound human tragedy about love, loss, and the most relentless force in the universe, time. We will dive into the archives, examine the scientific theories that attempted to explain what happened, and follow Ethan's journey from the moment he stepped into the shadow of the cave to his shocking return to a world he no longer recognized. To unravel this mystery with me and to not miss our other investigations into the most incredible paradoxes, be sure to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. Believe me, this story will change your perception of reality. To understand the depth of Ethan Hayes' tragedy, we must first return to his world, the world of 1974. It was an era balancing on the edge of the past and the future. The Watergate scandal had just forced President Nixon to resign, shaking the nation's faith in its government. Muscle cars roared on the highways, not yet aware of the coming oil crisis. There were no mobile phones in people's pockets, and the idea of a global network connecting everyone belonged only to the pages of science fiction novels. The world was analog, tangible, and seemed to flow much more slowly. It was in this world, in a small town named Greystone, Montana, lost among the Rocky Mountains, that 26-year-old Ethan Hayes lived. He was a product of his time, ambitious, confident in science and progress. For him, the ground beneath his feet was not just soil, but an open book full of geological mysteries he dreamed of solving. He was one of the top graduates of his class and was predicted to have a brilliant career. But his main driving force was not his career. It was Clara. Clara Jennings, his fiancée, was his complete opposite. A local artist, she saw not minerals and strata in the same mountains, but inspiration and ancient magic. They were like fire and ice, science and art, but their love was the center around which their universes revolved. Their plans were simple and beautiful. A modest wedding in the fall, a small house with a white picket fence, children who would grow up under the vast Montana sky. Their future seemed as solid and unshakable as the mountains that surrounded them. Ethan was a scientist to the bone. He believed in what could be touched, measured, and proven. For him, there were no curses or miracles, only phenomena yet to be explained. So when he heard the local legends about a cave in the Black Creek Canyon, he just smiled condescendingly. The Native Americans of the Crow tribe, who had lived here for centuries, called it Itzwaakap Balia, which means the place where time is silent. They passed down stories from generation to generation about brave men who entered and never returned, or returned different. For them, it was a sacred, forbidden place. For Ethan, it was a promising research site, Object 74. Preliminary scans had shown anomalous magnetic fields and hints of unique crystal structures. This could be the discovery of a lifetime. On the morning of May 12, 1974, the air was fresh and promised a warm day. As Ethan packed his geological hammer, compass, and radio into his backpack, he listened to Clara ask him to be careful for the 100th time. "It's just a piece of rock, honey," he laughed. "Nothing dangerous." He kissed her goodbye at the gate. "I'll be back by 6. Put the steaks on the grill." He got into his old pickup truck, waved to her, and drove down the dusty road toward his greatest discovery. It was the last time Clara would see her fiancé as she had known him her whole life, young, smiling, and confident that he was in control of the world. The closer Ethan got to the Black Creek Canyon, the more distinctly he felt a change. The familiar sounds of the forest, the singing of birds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects began to fade, as if someone were slowly turning down a volume knob. At the very entrance to the cave, a complete, oppressive silence fell. Even the wind seemed afraid to enter. The entrance was astonishing. Not a jagged crack in the rock, but an almost perfect smooth circular opening, about 3 meters in diameter, as if a giant drill had passed through the granite, leaving behind molten edges. As a geologist, Ethan knew that nature doesn't work this way. This was the first thing that made his scientific curiosity mix with a slight sense of unease. He switched on his powerful headlamp and stepped inside. Cold. Not the damp, chilling cold of a normal cave, but a dry, sterile cold, as if the air had been stripped of all life. And the silence. Not just the absence of sound, the absence of echo. He coughed, expecting the sound to bounce off the walls and travel deeper, but it simply died, swallowed by the darkness, as if he were standing in a room lined with sound-absorbing velvet. The beam of his headlamp caught the walls. They weren't made of limestone or granite. They were covered in panels of smooth, black crystals, similar to obsidian, but with one strange property. They barely reflected any light. The beam of his lamp just sank into their surface. Running a gloved hand along the wall, he felt that it was perfectly smooth and cold as ice. He walked about 20 meters deeper into a small chamber. Here, crystals grew from the floor, forming strange angular structures. The radio on his belt was silent, emitting only a steady, quiet hiss. He decided to take a sample. This was what he had come for. Pushing aside the irrational feeling of unease, he took his trusty geological hammer from his belt. The steel glinted coldly in the lamplight. He chose one of the crystals and swung. The moment the hammer touched the crystal, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, there was no sound of impact. None. Absolutely none. Second, a strong but completely silent vibration passed through the floor and walls, as if the entire cave had shuddered with a mute scream. Third, his headlamp went out for a second, plunging him into absolute darkness, and then flickered back on. His heart was pounding in his chest. He quickly dropped to his knees. The crystal had fractured, revealing perfectly flat cleavages. Ethan, acting on a scientist's autopilot, quickly gathered a few fragments into a special bag. The feeling of wrongness about this place had reached its peak. He decided that was enough. The samples were sufficient. It was time to go back. He turned and walked towards the exit, which was visible as a bright patch of light just a few steps away. He looked at his watch. The hands were frozen. He thought, probably the magnetic anomaly. But according to his internal sense, no more than 5, maybe 7 minutes had passed since he entered. He even chuckled to himself, thinking about how he would tell Clara about this creepy but fascinating cave. He was sure dinner wasn't even cold yet. He stepped out of the cold, dead shadow of the cave into the bright, warm sun, squinted for a second to adjust to the light, and froze in his tracks. The world outside the cave was not the one he had left 5 minutes ago. And the feeling of terror that washed over him in that moment was incomparable to anything he had ever experienced.
The first thing he felt was the warmth. The gentle, caressing warmth of the May sun, which contrasted so pleasantly with the deathly cold of the cave. But then came the second sensation. Something was wrong with the sound. The air was no longer dead. It was alive, filled with a hum that hadn't been there before. He looked around. The forest, at first glance, was the same pines, the same rocks, but his gaze fell on the road he had driven on. The dusty, bumpy dirt track he knew so well was gone. In its place was a perfectly flat black ribbon of asphalt, smooth, without a single crack. A bright yellow line ran down the middle of the road. Ethan swallowed. The local authorities had been promising to pave this road for decades, but they never had the money. His gaze darted further, to the horizon, and there, on the tops of the distant hills, 3 white towers slowly and silently turned their giant blades. Wind turbines. Ethan had only seen such things in futuristic magazines. The idea of clean energy in 1974 was just an exotic concept, not a part of the Montana landscape. A chill ran down his spine. He spun around to where he had left his old, beaten-up Ford F-100 pickup. The spot where he had parked it was gone, as was the truck itself. Instead, a thick young bush was growing from the ground, reaching his waist. He moved closer, pushed aside the branches, touching the ground as if hoping to feel the ruts from the tires. Nothing. Just dense, packed earth. For a shrub to grow to this size, it would need at least several years. Panic, cold and clammy, began to rise from the pit of his stomach. A prank? Someone's very cruel, elaborate joke? Flashed through his mind. He started running down the new highway towards the town, a couple of miles away, and with every step his confidence in reality crumbled. Cars sped past him, but they weren't cars he knew. They were sleek, streamlined, almost silent. Some moved with no engine roar at all. They looked like smooth pieces of glass and metal, aliens from the future. The drivers inside looked at him, a bearded, disheveled man in 70s hiking gear running along the shoulder with wild eyes like he was a ghost. When he reached the outskirts of Greystone, his heart skipped a beat. The town was alien. McRady's old general store where he bought his nails was gone. In its place was a glass building with an Apple logo. The wooden gas station had become an automated station with a dozen pumps. The familiar 2-story houses had vanished, replaced with modern cottages. He ran through streets that bore the same names but led to a different world. People shied away from him. In their hands were glowing rectangles they stared at intently. They spoke into the air through tiny devices in their ears. Ethan was the alien. He was the only real person in a world gone mad. In desperation, he saw a familiar building, the public library. He burst inside, nearly knocking over the automatic glass doors. Inside, there were no familiar card catalogs, only rows of glowing screens and the hum of computers. A stack of fresh newspapers lay on the counter. With trembling hands, he grabbed the top one. His eyes found the date in the corner. The words blurred, but he forced himself to focus. May 12th, 2024. The newspaper fell from his weakened fingers. The sounds of the library faded away, the world shrinking to a single point. He had been in the cave for 5 minutes, and the world had lived for 50 years without him. For the first few hours at the police station, Ethan didn't speak. He sat in a state of deep, catatonic shock. To the officers, he was another puzzle. No ID, no prints in modern databases, dressed like an actor from a period film. They figured he was either on powerful drugs or suffering from a severe form of amnesia. They spoke to him gently, offered him water, asked if he remembered his name. And when he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and broken. He said his name, Ethan Hayes. And he didn't ask who the president was or what had happened to the world. He asked about her, Clara Jennings. Do you know where she is? A young officer, sighing, sat down at a computer. For him, it was just part of the routine. Run a name through the archives to figure out who they were dealing with. He entered the data and froze. The look of boredom on his face was replaced by utter astonishment. He called his superior. 10 minutes later, the entire department was gathered around the monitor. On the screen was a card from an old, digitized archive. Ethan Hayes, age 26. Status: missing, presumed deceased since May 12, 1974. The file had his picture. The man in the photo and the man sitting in front of them were the same person. The police chief, a gray-haired veteran, looked at Ethan with new eyes. He checked the data for Clara Jennings. And a miracle, or perhaps a cruel irony of fate, she was alive, never married, never moved. She was still living in that same small house on Maple Street that she and Ethan were planning to buy after their wedding. The drive to her house was the longest of Ethan's life. He sat in the back of the police car as the alien city floated by the window. He tried to prepare himself for what he would see. He tried to imagine Clara older, but his imagination could only picture her 26-year-old face with a few wrinkles around her eyes. The reality was far more merciless. The car stopped in front of a small, well-kept house that seemed like an island from the past amidst the modern cottages. The white picket fence they had once painted together was peeling. The roses in the garden had grown wild. Ethan walked out on the car on unsteady legs. The police chief walked with him, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. He went up the porch steps and pressed the doorbell. From inside, he heard a slow, shuffling sound, a sound that made Ethan's heart clench, the sound of a walker or a cane. The door creaked open. On the threshold stood a stooped, gray-haired woman. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles, charting a long life lived in solitude. Her hands, gripping a cane, were gnarled with arthritis. It was an old woman, a stranger. But then their eyes met, and in her faded blue eyes, Ethan saw her, his Clara. The same gaze, the same spark that he had loved so much. She stared at him for several long, endless seconds. Her lips trembled. At first, her eyes showed confusion, then recognition like a bolt of lightning, and then a boundless, all-consuming pain and joy at the same time. Tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks. "Ethan," she whispered in a voice that he had never heard, the voice of old age. "I knew it. I knew you would come back. I always knew." He stepped forward to embrace her, and in that moment, the full cruelty of his paradox crashed down on him. He wanted to hold his young, vibrant fiancée in his arms, but his hands were embracing a frail, weakened body. He could feel her skin, thin as parchment under his fingers. He smelled not her perfume, but medicine and old age. For him, 5 minutes had passed. For her, 50 years. A whole lifetime of waiting, of faded hope, and of loneliness. He had returned, but he was a lifetime too late. His world wasn't just lost, it was stolen by time, leaving him a living ghost, mourning a love that for him had died only a few minutes ago.